My mom revealed my darkest secret to make everyone laugh. I revealed hers to make everyone leave. I always knew my mother loved being the center of attention. If there was a family gathering, she controlled every conversation. If someone shared good news, she'd somehow turn it into a story about herself. If anyone made a mistake, she'd repeat it for years because, in her words, funny stories keep the family close. Everyone laughed. No one ever asked whether the person she was laughing at found it funny too. Growing up, I was usually the target. She told relatives about the time I cried on my first day of kindergarten. She loved reminding everyone how I once threw up during a school play. Even in my 20s, she'd still bring up embarrassing stories whenever someone new joined the conversation. Whenever I asked her to stop, she'd wave her hand and tell me I was too sensitive. It's just a joke. That sentence became her excuse for everything. Eventually, I stopped arguing. I learned the easiest way to survive family dinners was to smile politely and wait for the conversation to move on. Then came my cousin Jessica's engagement party. Nearly 40 people filled my aunt's backyard. There was food, music, and relatives I hadn't seen in years. For once, everything felt peaceful. Until someone suggested sharing funny family memories. The moment I heard those words, I felt my stomach tighten. I knew exactly where this was going. My mother smiled. She stood up with a glass of wine in her hand and immediately became the center of attention. She started with harmless stories, then slightly more embarrassing ones. Everyone laughed. She kept going. I silently prayed she'd stop. Instead, she looked directly at me. Then she told the story I'd spent years trying to leave behind. When I was 19, I'd struggled with severe depression after losing 2 close friends in a car accident. It was the darkest period of my life. I isolated myself from everyone. I nearly dropped out of college. With therapy and support, I eventually recovered. Only a handful of people knew the full story. I had trusted my mother enough to tell her because I believed she would protect that part of my life. Instead, she turned it into entertainment. She laughed while telling everyone how dramatic I'd been. She joked about how I stayed in bed for weeks. She even imitated things I'd said during that period. People didn't know how to react. Some laughed awkwardly because they thought they were supposed to. Others looked at me with obvious discomfort. I sat completely frozen. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every painful memory I'd shared with her in confidence was now being used as the evening's punchline. When she finally finished, she smiled proudly and looked around the table as if expecting applause. Then she looked at me, still smiling, and asked, "See, isn't that funny now?" That's when I realized something. She wasn't sharing my secret by accident. She knew exactly what she was doing. And for the first time in my life, I decided I wasn't going to quietly take it anymore. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The laughter faded almost instantly. A few relatives looked down at their plates. Others pretended to be busy with their drinks. No one wanted to acknowledge how uncomfortable the atmosphere had become. My mother didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she simply didn't care. She took another sip of wine and smiled as though she'd just delivered the funniest story of the night. Then she looked at me again. She asked why I looked so serious. According to her, everyone had difficult moments in life. She insisted that if I couldn't laugh about mine by now, I needed to lighten up. That sentence hurt more than the story itself. Not because it embarrassed me, because it reminded me that she had never once apologized for making my pain into entertainment. I slowly stood up. My hands were shaking, not with anger, with disappointment. I looked around the backyard. Almost everyone avoided making eye contact. No one wanted to get involved. I understood. Family dynamics can make even good people stay silent. Then I calmly thanked my mother for reminding everyone that private conversations apparently weren't private after all. She laughed. She thought I was playing along. She even encouraged me to tell one of her embarrassing stories in return. She expected something harmless. Maybe the time she'd fallen into a swimming pool, or gotten lost on vacation. She had no idea what was about to happen. I told everyone there was something I'd kept quiet about for years because I believed it wasn't my place to share. Then I explained why I'd changed my mind. If private struggles were now considered public entertainment, then apparently the rules had changed. The smile slowly disappeared from my mother's face. She knew exactly what I was referring to. About 4 years earlier, my father had quietly discovered that she had been having an emotional affair with a former coworker. There had been thousands of messages. Late-night phone calls. Secret lunches. It never became physical, at least according to both of them, but it nearly ended my parents' 30-year marriage. My father chose counseling instead of divorce. He forgave her. They rebuilt their relationship together. Very few people knew any of it because my father had wanted to protect the family from unnecessary gossip. I had respected that decision. For years. Until that moment. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't insult her. I simply stated the truth. Then I explained that my father had shown her compassion by keeping one of the hardest chapters of her life private. The same compassion she had refused to show me only minutes earlier. The backyard became completely silent. No one laughed. No one smiled. One of my aunts quietly put down her fork. My cousins stared at the ground. Even the music from the speakers suddenly felt too loud. My mother's face turned completely pale. She tried to interrupt. She claimed it wasn't the same thing. She insisted I had crossed a line. I calmly asked her one question. How is my private pain funny? But your private mistakes off limits? She opened her mouth. Nothing came out, because there wasn't an answer. Within minutes, guests started making excuses to leave. Some suddenly remembered early mornings. Others claimed they needed to get home to their kids. The engagement party ended nearly 2 hours early. Not because of what I revealed. Because everyone had finally seen what happened when someone else's private life became entertainment. As the last cars pulled out of the driveway, my mother stood alone on the patio. For the first time in my life, she understood exactly what public humiliation felt like. I didn't feel victorious. That's the part people always seem surprised by. As I drove home that night, my hands were still shaking. Not because I regretted defending myself, because I hated that it had come to that. I never wanted to expose one of the worst chapters of my parents' marriage. I only wanted my mother to understand what she'd done to me. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages. Some relatives told me I had gone too far. Others admitted they couldn't believe my mother had shared something so personal about my mental health in front of dozens of people. A few simply said they didn't know whose side to take. My father didn't text. He called. I answered immediately. There was a long silence before he spoke. I expected him to be furious. Instead, he sounded tired. He told me he'd heard everything. Someone had recorded part of the argument and sent it to him before he even got home. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He wasn't angry that I'd revealed the affair. He was heartbroken that things had reached the point where his daughter believed that was the only way to make her mother stop. He admitted something I'd never known. Over the years, he'd asked my mother countless times to stop turning family members into punchlines. She always dismissed his concerns. She insisted everyone was too sensitive. She claimed embarrassing stories were simply how families bonded. No one had ever truly challenged her. Until me. A few days later, my mother asked to meet. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe halfway across town. She arrived wearing sunglasses even though it was cloudy outside. For the first several minutes, she didn't apologize. Instead, she talked about how embarrassed she'd been. How relatives were avoiding her calls. How Jessica's engagement party had become the family's newest source of gossip. I listened quietly. Finally, I asked one question. Do you understand why I was hurt? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared into her coffee. When she finally spoke, her voice was much quieter than I'd ever heard it. She admitted that when she'd told my story, she genuinely thought enough time had passed for it to be funny. She'd convinced herself that because I'd recovered, the pain no longer mattered. She never considered that healing didn't erase the memory. Or that the story had never belonged to her to tell. It wasn't a perfect apology. She still tried to justify parts of her behavior. But it was the closest she'd ever come to taking responsibility. I accepted the apology. Not because it erased what happened. Because carrying that anger forever wasn't the life I wanted. Accepting her apology didn't mean everything went back to normal. It didn't. For a long time, I stopped sharing personal details with her. If something important happened in my life, she was usually the last person to hear about it. Not out of revenge. Out of caution. Trust isn't rebuilt with words. It's rebuilt through consistency. And that takes time. Slowly, she started changing. At family gatherings, she caught herself before telling stories that weren't hers to tell. More than once, I watched her say, "That's not my story to share." It was such a simple sentence. Yet I'd never heard her say it before. I don't know whether she changed because of what happened that night, or because she finally experienced what she'd spent years doing to other people. Maybe it was both. Either way, our relationship would never be exactly what it had been. Some cracks don't disappear. They simply become part of the foundation you learn to live with. A year passed. Life slowly settled into a new routine. Family gatherings became quieter. Not awkward. Just different. People seemed more careful about what they shared. If someone started telling an embarrassing story about another relative, they usually stopped halfway through and asked if the person was okay with it first. It was a small change. But it changed the atmosphere of our entire family. Jessica eventually got married. At her wedding reception, nearly everyone from that engagement party was there. I wasn't sure what to expect. My mother and I had been polite with each other over the past year, but we still kept a certain emotional distance. During dinner, someone jokingly suggested that the parents should each tell a funny story about the bride. For a split second, I saw everyone glance toward my mother. It was almost automatic. For years, she would have been the first person to stand up. Instead, she smiled, shook her head, and said something that surprised the entire table. She said Jessica deserved to tell her own stories. Not anyone else. Then she raised her glass and simply wished the newlyweds a lifetime of kindness and respect. It wasn't a dramatic moment. Most people probably forgot it within minutes. I didn't. Because I knew how difficult those words were for her. Later that evening, while everyone was dancing, my mother quietly walked over to me. She didn't mention the engagement party. She didn't mention the affair. She didn't mention my depression. She simply said she'd been seeing a therapist for several months. She admitted that she'd spent most of her life believing that making people laugh was the same as making them feel loved. Only after losing the trust of her own daughter did she realize those were two very different things. She told me she'd been trying to understand why she always needed to be the funniest person in the room. For the first time, I believed she was doing the work instead of looking for excuses. I hugged her. Not because everything had been fixed, because healing had finally become real. Today, our relationship is better than it has been in years. It's not perfect. There are still subjects we approach carefully. There are still moments when old habits almost return. But now, if she accidentally crosses a boundary, she apologizes. Immediately. Without telling me I'm too sensitive. Without saying it was just a joke. That simple change means more than she probably realizes. Looking back, people often ask whether exposing her secret was worth it. I never answer with a simple yes or no. I wish I'd never had to. I wish she'd listened the first dozen times I asked her to stop humiliating me. I wish my darkest chapter had never become entertainment in the first place. But I also know this. Some people don't understand the damage they're causing until they experience it themselves. My mother revealed my deepest secret because she wanted everyone to laugh. I revealed hers because I wanted the laughter to stop. It did. And in the silence that followed, our family finally started learning the difference between laughing at someone and loving them. It has been almost 3 years since that night. If you came to one of our family gatherings today, you would probably never guess what happened. The conversations are different now. People still laugh. They still tell stories. But there's one unspoken rule that everyone seems to understand. If the story isn't yours, it isn't yours to tell. My mother keeps that rule better than anyone. Sometimes she'll start to share something about one of us, pause halfway through, and ask, "Are you okay if I tell this?" It sounds like such a small question. To me, it's everything. Because for most of my life, I never had that choice. One afternoon, while we were cleaning out old boxes in my parents' attic, we found a photo album from when I was a teenager. There were pictures from birthdays, vacations, school events, and family holidays. My mother picked up one photo of me from the year I struggled with depression. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly closed the album. She looked at me and said she finally understood that surviving something painful doesn't make it public property. Some memories deserve privacy, no matter how much time has passed. It was the apology I'd been waiting years to hear. Not because it was perfectly worded, because I knew she finally understood. People sometimes ask if I regret revealing her affair. The honest answer is yes. I regret that it ever became necessary. I regret hurting my father by bringing one of the hardest periods of his life into the open. If I could go back in time, I'd much rather have a mother who respected boundaries than a moment that forced her to learn them. But I don't regret standing up for myself. There comes a point when staying silent teaches people that your silence is permission. Mine wasn't. My mother and I will never have the relationship we might have had if trust had never been broken. Some things can't be completely repaired. But they can become honest. And sometimes, honesty is a stronger foundation than pretending nothing ever happened. Looking back now, I don't remember the laughter that echoed through my cousin's engagement party. I remember the silence that came after. Because that silence accomplished what years of polite conversations never could. It made everyone in the family stop and think before turning someone else's pain into entertainment. The biggest lesson I learned wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. Humiliation can make a room laugh for a few seconds. Respect can keep a family together for a lifetime. If someone trusts you with their darkest chapter, treat it like a gift. Not a story to entertain strangers. Because once trust becomes the punchline, the joke is never funny again.